Mr. President, I was surprised to hear the minority leader suggest that today's session of the Senate, a Saturday session, which I suppose is inconvenient, but nonetheless something we ought to do to work on things that are important for the American people. I was surprised to hear him say it was a waste of the taxpayers' money. I'll talk a little bit about what I think is a waste of the taxpayers' money, but coming here, doing the country's business, trying to reduce the federal budget deficit, trying to make important decisions about the tax issues is not a waste of time or money in my judgment. One of the things that I find disheartening these days in the political debate about these issues is the increasing tendency for one side of a political debate to create their new set of realities. They just invent a new set of realities. And then from that invention, they go ahead and make their arguments. And by the way, most of the reporting then is off of that invention. I mean, it'd be nice if the reporting would say, you know, that is not a reality, that's an invention. If, for example, we said the earth is round, and there's substantial scientific evidence that the earth is round, and the other side said, no, the earth is flat, tomorrow there'd be a story that said opinions differ on shape of earth. Well, of course, the facts don't differ, but that's the way these things exist these days, the creation of their own new reality. Now, let me talk about what has happened with respect to the tax cuts. And let me give just a bit of history because I think it's important. 2001, taxes were cut. I didn't vote for it, I voted against it. Let me tell you why. I don't want to just revisit that at great length, but the proposal to cut taxes in 2001 came on the heels of the year 2000, when for the first time in 30 years, this country had a budget surplus. A budget surplus, mind you. And the economists and others expected and they projected that the surpluses would exist way into the future. For the next 10 years, we would have budget surpluses, they predicted. Well, I didn't believe that, but nonetheless, President George W. Bush, new to the office, said, well, if we're going to have budget surpluses going forward, let's make sure we give them back to the American people in the form of tax cuts. I said, well, why don't we be a bit conservative? What if we don't have these surpluses? They're only projections, after all. We don't have them. They are just projections by economists that in many cases can't remember their home phone number for 2 days, give us projections for 5 and 10 years. Let's be a little conservative. No, they said we don't want to be conservative. Let's do these tax cuts, the bulk of which will go to the wealthiest because those who constructed these tax cuts always believe that there's a trickle-down effect in this country. So if you give money at the top, it'll trickle down and help everybody. So the tax cuts were passed. I voted against them. And immediately we discovered we were in a recession. Then we were hit with a terrorist attack on 9/11. Then we were at a war in Afghanistan. Then a war in Iraq. And those wars have lasted for most of a decade. And not only were there no surpluses at all, no budget surpluses at all, in fact, there were giant budget deficits. None of the expenditures of these wars were paid for. All of it was added to the debt. And the debt has now ballooned to $13 trillion with a yearly budget deficit of $1.3 trillion, having now just gotten to the other side, the other plateau, on the deepest recession since the Great Depression. So here's where we find ourselves. That's the history of it. Tax cuts that were voted for by the Congress, proposed by George W. Bush, then President Bush, in order to give back surpluses for the next 10 years. No surpluses ever existed. Then we went to war and never paid for a penny of the war. And now we end up with a deficit of $1.3 trillion a year and a federal budget debt of $13 trillion. Now the question is, what do we do about all that? Clearly these deficits and debt threaten the country. They threaten our financial stability and solvency. I worry very much that one day the bond traders and the currency traders might get an urge to say, you know what, we don't think that economy is very stable, and we're going to make a run on that economy, as they have done. Nothing has changed in Spain from now versus 6 months ago, and yet once they run against that economy, there are profound consequences and could be for this country as well. I worry a great deal about that. We have got to get our house in order. Now, let me talk about the debate this morning, because I think most people don't understand what the debate is. It's not reported very well and not even described very well here. The proposition is to extend the tax cuts. So the question is, well, for whom? One proposal we voted on this morning was for single people earning up to $200,000 and married couples earning $250,000. But what is important to understand is the proposal to extend the tax cuts extends to income earned by everybody. The first $250,000 earned by Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Donald Trump, they would get a tax cut on their first $250,000 of income. A lot of people don't understand that. They think if the proposal is if you have over $250,000 of income, you don't get a tax cut. That's not true.
Mr. President, would the Senator yield for just one question?
Be happy to yield.
I think the point you're making here is really important, and I want to ask a question of you through the chair. So what we just voted on, basically, that 53 members of the Senate, which used to be a winning number around the United States Senate until this new era of we've got to have 60 votes for motherhood and apple pie, 53 members of the Senate voted to make sure that everyone in America had no tax increase on their first $1 million in income. Is that correct?
Correct.
So it's not that we're not passing a tax cut for everyone. We're passing a tax cut for every person in America. We're just saying maybe on that second million, we might ought to take that $300 billion and put it in deficit reduction. So it's not the first million. It's the second million and the third million and the fourth million and the fifth million that you would have to go back to a rate that we had in the days when we had massive job creation and these guys did really, really well.
That's correct. And I voted for the $1 million, although I thought it's probably good politics. I didn't think that was good policy either. But just to demonstrate that there's no level that the minority here will support except all the income for the wealthiest Americans. I want to show my colleagues what we proposed, and that is these lines show the amount of tax cuts that will go to all Americans under the proposal that we offered this morning. Everyone would get a tax cut up to that $250,000 of income because the rates were changed, so they would all be changed back for everyone, and that includes Bill Gates, Donald Trump, Warren Buffett, and everyone. Now, the average tax cut for the average American would be about $900. The tax cut under this proposal for those earning $1 million or more will be over $6,000. So the wealthiest Americans will get 6 times the tax cut that the average American will get. That was our proposal. The minority party said, well, that's not right. You can't do 6 times more. We want you to do 1,000 times more for the wealthiest. So let me show a chart that describes what the minority is insisting upon. All of this yellow, which I just showed, would be tax cuts for every income group, and the red are the proposed increases in tax cuts by the minority. What they have said is for those with $1 million or more, we insist that they get a tax cut that is 1,000 times the size of the tax cut for the average American. Average American gets a tax cut of about $900, and a person making $1 million under the Republican plan will get a tax cut of $104,000 a year. A year. They're demanding that the wealthiest Americans get a tax cut that is 1,000 times the size of the average American. Why? Because we believe tax cuts should go all the way across the board on the first $250,000 for everybody, all the way across, on all income for everybody, up to $250,000. The minority says that's not enough. We want that tax cut to go all the way up to every dollar of income to the wealthiest Americans. That's unbelievable to me. We're $13 trillion in debt. We're at war. We have a $1.3 trillion annual budget deficit, and they're demanding that we give $104,000 a year in tax breaks to people that make $1 million a year? It's unbelievable. And they say, by the way, well, this is all about small business. Again, that's creating a new reality that's simply not accurate. Now, I want to show you what has happened to the federal debt. This line looks like the upslope on a roller coaster, a very steep one, by the way. $13 trillion in debt. This shows 1995 to today. Most people think this is urgent. This is a real serious problem. If that's the case, what are we doing talking about giving tax cuts of $100,000 apiece to people that make $1 million a year? Now, the other point about this is all of the tax cuts that would be offered come from money that is borrowed. By the way, the projections by the Office of Management and Budget and the Congressional Budget Office about what the deficits are going to be, those projections assume that there are no extensions of any tax cuts. None, zero. So anything that is extended increases the federal budget deficit and debt. So the proposition is, if we're going to provide tax cuts, as a minority insists, for all the income of the wealthiest Americans, what they are saying is, let's borrow another $1 trillion, put it on top of the debt, in order for us to provide tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans. Again, it's preposterous. Let me use this chart to see if maybe common sense travels over the decades. Will Rogers once said during a significant economic downturn, he said, the unemployment here ain't eating regular, but we'll get around to them as soon as everybody else gets fixed up okay. The unemployed around here ain't eating regular, Will Rogers says, but we'll get them fixed up. We'll get around to them as soon as everybody else is fixed up. Well, you know, there are 2 million people a couple days ago lost their unemployment benefits. 2 million people. The other day I came to the floor and talked about Smith Barney versus Barney Smith. There's a Barney Smith from Indiana who talked about losing his job because his plant closed and his job went to China. Not unusual. 5 million manufacturing workers have lost their jobs. And Barney Smith asked the question about this Congress. Is the Congress willing to care as much about Barney Smith as it is about Smith Barney? Barney Smith from Indiana or Smith Barney from Wall Street? The answer is pretty evident around here these days. This fight today is really about that kind of distinction. Who do you stand for? Who are you fighting for? Who are you standing with? Is it because you believe this country only works if you put a lot of money in at the top and it'll trickle down to everybody? I mean, I've never believed that worked. I believe if you give the American working family something to work with, the percolate up theory, give the American family something to work with, and that American engine will do just fine. Let me just make the case that and I don't mean this in a partisan way, but I think it's important to say that these tax cuts, since they were proposed in 2001, and the run-up in the deficit that came with it, and the creation of a sick economy, it is the lowest average annual percentage increase in job creation of any president since the 1940s. Talk about the Bush presidency. He proposed very large tax cuts, the bulk of it which goes to the wealthiest Americans, and the result is the lowest average annual percentage increase in job creation of any president since the 1940s. Now, I did vote in 1993, that's a long time ago, for the economic policy changes proposed in the Clinton administration. And those were tough votes and controversial votes. And yes, they increased some taxes and cut some spending. You know what? In the coming years and during the 8 years of that administration, as a result, in my judgment, of a change in economic policy, we had 23.1 million new jobs created. 23.1 million new jobs. Real median household income grew 14%. GDP growth averaged 3.5%. So it doesn't wash to say that we have to follow the same economic policy that was followed in the last decade, giving tax cuts to the wealthiest and then just praying that somehow it'll all trickle down to help everybody. This country's in some significant trouble. And this country and the people in this country deserve and expect thoughtful, serious, tough decisions by this Congress. David Stockman, former director of OMB in the Reagan administration, was on television a while back, and he said if there were such a thing as Chapter 11 for politicians, the Republican push to extend the unaffordable Bush tax cuts would amount to a bankruptcy filing. Well, let me say again, I'm not someone who comes here talking about Republicans and Democrats very often. I don't think either political party is a great bargain for the American people, at least in recent times. We need to understand that it's important to get the best of what both parties have to offer rather than the worst of each. We need to come together to decide we serve the same interest, that is the long-term best interest of this country, to put the country back on track. But I can't any longer watch people invent a reality in order to support a kind of proposal that is going to weaken this country and increase the federal indebtedness of this country. It simply makes no sense. I had originally tried to see if I could, because there needs to be some reality, I tried to put a chart together, and the problem is it was too tall, so I taped it, but this chart shows, in reality, the 1,000 times tax cut for millionaires and above versus the average tax cut for the American people. This shows the tax cut that goes to everybody under the plan that we offered this morning. Everybody, including the wealthiest Americans, will get a tax cut on their income up to $250,000 if they're married. The Republicans have said, which represents these red lines, that's not enough. We want this not just to go all the way across, we demand that it goes all the way up. Well, we're lucky it doesn't reach the ceiling, because we're talking about massive amounts of money to be borrowed in order to provide tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans. I wish this would fit on a smaller chart, but the absurdity of it is demonstrated by the kind of tax cuts they are demanding for the wealthiest Americans. Now, Mr. President, finally let me say, I know others want to speak, but let me say this. Historians are going to look back at this time, this moment, this Congress, and in 100 years we're all dead, and historians evaluate, what did we do here? What did we do? And they're going to be very troubled and very, very concerned to try to figure out what on earth were they thinking. At war, deep in debt, and doing tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. They're going to wonder, what on earth were they thinking? A friend of mine once asked the question, if you were to be given an assignment to write an obituary for someone you had never met, and the only information you had about this person now deceased was a check register, and from that you needed to write an obituary, what would you write? That question could be asked about this country. What would historians write about this country having only the federal budget to evaluate, about our value system? Who did we stand for? Did we stand for 2 million people who were out of work? 2 million times someone came home and had to say to their loved one, honey, I've lost my job. No, it wasn't because I did a bad job. My job's gone to China. I was told that the company's contracting. I've lost my job. 2 million times. Out of jobs, out of work, out of hope, out of the home. And then we're told, well, that's not the priority. Let's not help them. Let's not extend unemployment benefits, which we have always done during a significant economic downturn. Instead, let's see if we can provide more comfort to those that are the wealthiest Americans by providing them tax cuts that are 1,000 times the size of the tax cut that the average family will get when they open their mail and finally get their tax break. I mean, I don't understand that at all. That's not in keeping with what I understand our obligations to be to this country. Number one, to borrow $1 trillion, that's 750 billion plus interest, borrow it principally from China, increase the debt, and then say, well, how are we going to use it? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to use it to give it to the wealthiest Americans. And by the way, this altered state of reality, which the other side uses in every debate these days, this altered state of reality is to say, this is about small business. That is fundamentally untrue, and they know it. But it doesn't matter to them, because they know it'll get reported as they're helping small business. They're not. They're not helping this country. They're not helping small business. And in my judgment, I wish they would understand the need to work with us for the common destiny and common purpose of this country's long-term economic health. If I can conclude by saying I was disappointed this morning to see what happened, but I knew it was going to happen because there's precious little opportunity in this chamber for people to take a serious, sober look at these issues and decide what's best for the country. I think the American people deserve better, expect better, and I hope they get better in the coming days. Mr. President, I yield the floor.